Japanese colonization of Korea. This is 6.1 Rationales for Japanese imperialism. This cartoon eliminates the sheer dominance Japan had over Korea, with two soldiers with weapons stomping on a poor Korean man. It illustrates the Japanese goal to demolish everyday Korean life. It also makes note of Russia's equal desire to control Korea as well. This cartoon represents the annexation of Dokdo, a Korean island. Dokdo was one of the first territories to be overwhelmed by the Japanese. The tug-of-war between Korea and Russia shows that Korea was fought over because of how important it was seen for Asian imperial dominance. This is a quote by Emperor Meiji Matsuhito from around the time of the Meiji Restoration. Knowledge shall be sought for all over the world, and thus shall be strengthened the foundation of the imperial polity. This quote shows that one rationale for imperialism was spreading knowledge from the Meiji Restoration all over the world, specifically to Korea starting the early 20th century. This quote is from Korean Treaties, a book written by various authors in Korea protesting Japanese rule. The present Japanese regime in Korea is doing everything in their power to suppress Korean nationality. The government not only forbade the study of Korean language and history, but went so far as to make a systematic collection of all Korean history and literature and burn them. This shows that Japanese racism was one of the root causes of imperialism, and that most Japanese believed that Korean culture was inferior and needed to basically be burned in a fire. Social Darwinism was definitely one of the main rationales for Japanese imperialism. They wanted to expand, and Korea happened to be one of the countries unfortunate enough to be next to them. This goes hand in hand with racism, basically the Japanese man's burden in this case. There's a common belief that Korean culture was inferior, and that it was the duty of the Japanese to fix this for them.
This is 6.2 Japanese state expansion. Japan used intimidation and political machinations for years before they conquered Korea. They wanted to beat them to a pulp before they started colonization. As the map shows, the first invasion of Korea was more than 400 years ago, in the Imjin War of 1592. But it wasn't until 1910 that the entire Korean peninsula and the surrounding area was conquered by the Japanese. Colonizing Korea was a multi-step process for Japan. They took Korea by force using their military and attempted to erase Korean culture as a whole. They created shrines where Koreans were forced to worship. They forced Koreans to work in Japanese factories. They forced many Korean women into becoming comfort women for Japanese men. As seen, the Koreans were also strongly encouraged to change their last names to traditional Japanese names.
This is 6.3 Korean responses to Japanese imperialism. And this is a timeline of resistance efforts in Korea. Almost 2,000 attacks by Korean resistance groups occurred in the years leading up to colonization, which occurred in 1910. Like its name suggests, the March 1st movement took place on March 1st, 9 years after Korea became a colony. The next year, the newspaper the Chosun Ilbo was created. It was another 25 years before Korea became independent. The righteous armies appeared multiple times in Korean history, including during the Mongol invasion of Korea. When Japan occupied the Korean peninsula, many Koreans left to form resistance groups outside Korea. This is a picture of the righteous army of Jiang Mei in 1907. The March 1st movement, also called the Mansei demonstrations, was one of the first open displays of resistance by the Korean public against Japanese rule. The movement spread ideas of resistance across Korea and was a forerunner for the Korean independence movement. This is a picture taken during the March 1st movement. There is also nonviolent opposition to Japanese occupation. This is a logo of the Chosun Ilbo, the first newspaper to oppose the Japanese government after the ban of Korean newspapers was lifted. The ban was lifted partially because of the March 1st movement in 1919.
This is 6.4 Global Economic Development. Korea was taken by Japan in 1910. From 1870 to 1913, the GDP of Japan nearly doubled. This is not a coincidence. In the early 1900s, many factories sprung up in Korea, the majority of which were Japanese-owned. Korea was also forced to trade with Japan at their own detriment. This is evidence for how Japan's economy benefited immensely from imperializing Japan. This is a quote from a student in Korea describing their experience being taken from Korea to work for the Japanese in factories. The main resource taken from Korea was labor. This quote shows how Mitsubishi profited and gained their fortune from imperializing Japan. This is the company that we followed. They used Korea for labor to work in their factories for their own benefit and frequently to the detriment of Koreans. This chart shows how the resource in Korea was labor. Japan industrialized Korea, which brought them mass amounts of profit. They industrialized Korea for their own benefit. The number of factories, as well as the amount of production in Korea increased dramatically when imperialized by Japan, starting with 66 factories in 1911 and ending up with 965 factories in 1919.
This is 6.5 Japanese economic imperialism. This graph shows the growth of Korean exportation under Japanese rule. The resources of Korea, especially agriculture, fish, and timber, were exploited for Japanese benefit and growth, with 94% of Korean factories being Japanese-owned in 1939. This came at the detriment of the Koreans, who saw the resources quickly disappearing in the 1900s. This graph shows how Japan industrialized Korea after World War I for their own benefit. The majority of products made in Korea were transported to Japan, allowing Japanese society to continue advancing. By 1940, Korean exports in industry equaled exports in agriculture, meaning less food for Koreans but more products for Japan. This graph demonstrates the effects that the colonization of Korea had on the Japanese economy. Before Korea was under Japanese rule, foreign exports made up more than 95% of all Japanese exports. However, by 1940, this figure dropped to just 55%, the other 45% being trade with territories inside the Japanese Empire. This is largely due to the forced trade between Korea and Japan that made up a large portion of the Japanese economy.
This is 6.6 Causes for Migration in an Interconnected World. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japanese citizens slowly began migrating to Korea. By 1910, over 170,000 Japanese immigrants settled in Korea. Merchants began settling down and infiltrating Korean culture. This was a factor in Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910, and it gave them an advantage. This image shows Japanese people arriving on Korean shores and settling. As shown in multiple images, the Japanese used ships to get to Korea. More specifically, they were referred to as turtle ships, which were revolutionized at the beginning of Japan's attacks on Korea. Most citizens moved due to the markets being opened in Korea. After migrating, Japanese people usually set up shops as a way to earn an income. This led to a Japanese dominance of the Korean economy. Japanese people and soldiers made the journey to Korea as a way to advance on their annexation of Korea. They believed that the presence of Japanese people in Korea would help colonize it. As for familial roles, Japanese and Korean women alike were homebound. On the other hand, the men were required to support the family financially. The image shows how Japanese migration affected Korea. They rolled their culture over the lives of the Koreans. This is 6.7 Effects of Japanese Migration to Korea. The message behind the cartoon brings light to the reality of what it was like to be taken over by Japan. Coercion factors. A Japanese language was taught in schools. There was enforced loyalty to the emperor. Korean films and books were outlawed, and speaking Korean was forbidden. When it came to overtaking Korea, Japan took more of a cultural rather than physical standpoint. They outlawed Korean books, and people were only allowed to speak Japanese. They also emphasized loyalty to the emperor, and schools were taught in Japanese.
This is 6.8 Causation in the Imperial Age. This is an image of Koreans being executed after resisting the Japanese trying to take their land. The Japanese encouraged their citizens to settle in Korea. They would seize land from Korean farmers, and by 1910, over 170,000 Japanese were settled in Korea in a mass migration. These are our cited sources in APA.